The room is quiet before the day begins. A thin winter light presses at the curtains just enough to silver the combs on the dressing table and catch the facets of small bottles arranged like sentries. On the tabletop, folded with care, lies a square of cloth. It is not made ready for water. It is already damp, soaked in vinegar or some perfumed solution, and it waits the way a ritual waits, familiar and unquestioned. She sits without haste. The house around her is still wood-settling coal grates cooling from the night. No basin is drawn, no jug poured. Instead, she lifts the cloth and brings it to her face, pressing softly, then again, working along the brow and the line of the cheek. The touch stings a little. The vinegar rises quick and sharp, finds the nose and the eyes, and settles as a faint prickle that lingers on the skin. This is not a solitary choice. In city streets where pipes run too near drains, where water carries rumors of illness, the mourning cloth is a custom repeated from small cottages to large townhouses. Better a sting on the cheek, the saying goes, than a chill in the bones. Clean water is not trusted, especially in the tight neighborhoods where soot wipes easily from a windowsill, and the air carries smoke from factories and the sourness of horses. The cloth is an answer to that world, a barrier laid between the body and what might harm it. She works methodically the way her mother did, and the women before that. Eyes closed, she presses the square along the temples and over the lips draws it down the curve of the neck where collars sit and catch the day's warmth. The damp is brief, the smell is not. A faint vinegar halo clings to her skin, sharper than roses, cleaner than smoke, and it marks the room with its quiet authority. In the corner, a small pitcher waits untouched. Its presence is ceremonial now, a relic from old advice, not a tool. The season turns and the advice remains. Water is an uncertainty. Cold invites weakness. Sudden wetness invites illness. Doctors have spoken of chills and nervous frailty, and families have carried those warnings forward until they feel like common sense. The cloth becomes a kind of shield, thin, easy to prepare, always at hand, and the first gesture of the day is to press that shield to the face. The mirror gives back a pale reflection with a slight flush where the cloth has traveled. It is not a full wash, it is something gentler and more cautious. In this room, and in countless rooms like it, the meaning of clean is adjusted to fit what is possible, what is safe, what is respectable. The routine does not ask for water to run. It asks only for steadiness, fold, dampen, press, and move on. Around her, fabrics hold stories from previous weeks. Curtains that gathered coal dust at their hems, bed linens that caught the breath in the nightgowns that will meet the street, and its grit before noon. She knows it as everyone knows it, but the morning is not the time to reckon with every layer. The morning only asks that the face be tended, that the scent be composed, that the surface carry itself well into the day. She pauses to refold the square, turning a clean corner outward, and presses again along the jaw. The skin tingles. Where the cloth lands, it leaves both sting and reassurance. It is a small discomfort with a calm purpose. She sets the square down and lets the air finish the rest, a quick evaporation that tightens the cheeks and smooths the brow. No splashing, no dripping into collars, no basin to empty. The table remains orderly, the floor remains dry. This order matters. It is part of how the house runs, part of how the body is read by others. A woman who splashes is thought careless, a woman who shivers after cold water is thought reckless. A woman who observes the cloth is thought prudent. These are the quiet judgments that move from parlor to parlor, never said directly, always heard. In such a world, cleanliness is not a bright, wet gleam. It is a composed surface, calm skin. Composed scent, a ritual performed without spectacle. The cloth has its own scent now, vinegar shaded by the faint memory of whatever was mixed into the bowl, perhaps a florid note, perhaps a citrus peel steeped the day before. She folds it again smaller, then lays it back on the porcelain dish. The dish gathers these squares through the week, each one rinsed and redampened, each one taking on a little more of the house's air-coal starch lavender, sewn into a drawer somewhere. What happens in one bedroom happens in many a pattern across narrow brick streets and long terraces. The cloth is pressed, the cheek stings mirrors receive a quiet face. No one is in a hurry. The ritual is not meant to rouse, it is meant to settle. A room with sealed windows feels safer once the air carries vinegar and a hint of oil. Outside carts roll on cobbles and hooves strike, but inside the first layer of defense is already in place. She reaches for a towel to dry what is already drying a gesture as much as a task. The towel is soft from many mornings, it does not scrub or redden. In her memory, there are other mornings damp weather, a draft under the door, and the cloth marked those days too. It was said to guard against what could not be seen. Invisible dampness, winter breath, the drift of illness. Whether the danger comes from the street or the season, the habit remains the same. Now the skin holds the smell lightly like a veil. The cheeks feel awake but not flushed, composed rather than fresh. Fresh would ask for water, and water asks for trust. In these years, trust is given to what can be measured by the hand thickness of cloth. The immediate sting, the tidy surface of a table left dry. Trust is not given to a pipe that might run close to a drain, or a faucet that returns what the city has touched. Elsewhere in the house, servants move softly, accustomed to this order. A bowl of diluted vinegar is refreshed. A new square of cloth is folded and left where the light will find it. No one remarks upon it. The routine is its own instruction, passing silently from room to room, and from one household to the next. The day in this sense does not begin with washing, but with warding small repeated gestures that set the body apart from the world it must enter. If the skin grows tender in winter, that is accepted. If a mild redness lingers along the jaw, that too belongs to the morning, like the sound of a carriage or the distant call of a vendor. These marks fade under fabric and fragrance. The surface is prepared to meet the day, though the day will bring smoke and dust, and the cloth will answer again tomorrow in the same precise way. The square is lifted once more just briefly over the eyelids and the slope of the nose, and then laid aside. A breath runs in. It tastes faintly of vinegar, now bright and austere. The mirror shows the same face as yesterday's morning and the day before, and that sameness is part of the comfort. The ritual holds the hours together, persuading them to pass without surprise. In the hallway, light strengthens. The city gathers its energy, factory whistles coal, scuttled the churn of streets. Here the first act has ended, quiet and complete. The basin is still dry. The jug remains full. The cloth has done what it is asked to do, replace what is feared with what is familiar, and the room keeps its calm. Behind the calm is the belief that guides it: water can harm. Careful barriers protect. Whether this belief is fully true or only customary, it rules the morning all the same. And so the day opens not with a splash, but with a press, not with the shine of wet skin, but with the pale, faintly stung composure of a face prepared to be seen. Outside, the streets are already spreading soot in the air. Inside, the vinegar lingers and the house feels defended. She rises. The square rests folded again into itself, a small, persistent shield awaiting tomorrow's light. The door will open, the gown will move, and the city will meet a surface set carefully in place by cloth alone. The bottles wait in the morning light, their shoulders of cut glass catching thin beams and throwing them back as soft prisms on the dressing table. They stand beside the mirror like quiet witnesses, amber, rose, and pale green, each with a stopper that clicks lightly when lifted. The room remembers them. Fabric remembers them. The air has learned their names. She reaches for one without thinking. Habit chooses before preference does. A thin mist crosses the space between glass and skin. It lands along the line where the neck meets the shoulder, on the hollow at the wrist, at the edges of the hair, where the comb will pass. The scent does not fade, it settles. Perfume heavy and sure takes possession of what water was not invited to clean. It is an old agreement between body and bottle. The liquid is sharp with alcohol, thick with oils that speak louder than any trace of the night. It stings where the vinegar cloth left the skin awake. It bites gently, then warms. The first layer is only a beginning. Another bottle follows, something darker, resinous, and the room deepens. What has been called refinement gathers like fog. This is not a gesture made only here. Across neighborhoods where coal dust lies thinly on windowsills, where horse smell clings to the morning perfume, is the answer women carry. Doctors have warned of chills of weakness invited by cold water, and the warnings have seeded themselves into routine. To avoid washing is to be prudent. To drown the absence in fragrance is to be respectable. The bottle is not a luxury alone, it is a shield. She combs the scent through her hair with measured strokes, drawing it from crown to braid so that each turn of the head will breathe a floral shadow into the air. Scarves on the chair receive their share a gauzy rain of smell that sinks into weave and will not leave. Gloves' two palms, opened like small animals in sleep, are crossed by a swift cloud of perfume. It will meet other hands later, and the greeting will be a fragrance before it is a word. The house learns quickly. Curtains, once only curtains, are now reservoirs. Their heavy folds drink and hold. Bed sheets carry a quieter version of the same note, faint yet persistent, so that lying down is to lie in a field of cultivated air. Fabrics are rarely washed. They are perfumed, instead revised rather than renewed. The fragrance moves into every seam and hem until the rooms are stitched with it. Outside, the streets will ask much of the gown today. Dust will lift where carts pass. Smoke will drift. Yet the first protection is not a basin, it is a bottle. A woman who seems to carry roses cannot be mistaken for common. In drawing rooms, perfume is read before the face is fully seen. It is a sign put forth like a card status propriety belonging. The liquid is not gentle. It reddens where it is asked to do the work of washing. Alcohol opens the skin. Oils settle and stay. Irritation is a private matter. Composure is public. She accepts the small flame that arrives with every press of the stopper and tells herself what many tell themselves: beauty requires a price. Beneath the gown layers upon layers, the body will warm, and where warmth gathers, another veil of scent will follow. If discomfort rises, more perfume answers. The solution to perfume is relentlessly perfume. When the door opens, the fragrance walks with her. It trails down the staircase and drapes the banister in a sweetness that was not there before. In parlors where windows are kept shut against what is called harmful air, the smell collects calmly and waits for company. Other women bring their own clouds. The room becomes a mixture so dense that the air thickens like fabric. No one speaks of it. To remark on odor is to be coarse. Silence is refinement's companion. Servants pass in and out of these rooms with trays and quiet hands. Their bodies can feel the weight of the air before anyone announces it. Sometimes they grow lightheaded. Sometimes the smell climbs into their throats and stays after they have left the room. Still, routine is stronger than comfort. To open a window without instruction would be impertinent. To comment would be worse. The room is praised, its hush is admired. The fragrance is part of its calm. Children learn with a kind of solemn happiness. Little wrists extend for a careful dab, a small echo of their mother's morning. They watch mirrors and witness the exchange, a spray, a smile, a new composure. Fragrance is not only adornment, it is discipline, a lesson wrapped in sweetness. The ritual says that water invites risk, perfume repels it. The lesson travels easily from one generation to the next. Class 2 declares itself with scent. The rich possess bottles that shine like small trophies. Glass cut with facets, liquids, imported oils, concentrated enough that one drop lasts an afternoon. The poor own fewer bottles or none. Their bodies must answer the day more plainly, and the line between classes can be traced with the nose as much as with the eyes. In salons and theaters, it is safer to suffocate others than to risk the whiff of sweat that might betray a household's means. Evenings repeat the morning with less light and more bodies. In gatherings where windows remain sealed, where gaslight raises the temperature and wool holds it, there the mix of perfume becomes a weather of its own. Guests sometimes lean back for more air. Some feel faint and are led away without drama. A cloth of vinegar lifted to the nose in a corner. A few minutes pass. They return, and the music continues. Complaints would sound like ignorance. Everyone chooses poise instead. In this world, the perfume people wear does not only name flowers, it names beliefs. It declares that water cannot be trusted, that disease travels in drafts, that health is a matter of keeping certain distances and sustaining certain illusions. Perfume is said to cleanse the air, to stand guard against what cannot be seen, to mask not just odor but misfortune. It is cosmetic and talisman at once. The layers of the gown hold all of this efficiently. Somewhere beneath lace and ribbon, the body works, warmth rises, salt forms, cloth absorbs. Perfume finds that place as well, so that scent and sweat knot together into something thicker than either one alone. In theaters and carriages and crowded pews, the mixture moves with everyone, a communal atmosphere of intention and denial. People sense it, no one names it. Words would be less graceful than endurance. There are moments when alone at night, a woman may notice the red line at her wrist, where the stopper's edge touched too often, or the roughness along the throat where the alcohol did what it always does. Such things are small and private, far smaller than a day's impression upon neighbors and strangers. In the morning, the bottles will stand again with their cut-glass shoulders as patient as ever. The remedy for irritation is the same as its cause. Habit is a circle that prefers not to be broken. Servants air a shawl near a window without opening it too wide. They spray curtains that were already sprayed yesterday. They fold a scented handkerchief and lay it where a hand will find it without looking. Their own hands smell of rose and musk long after the chores are finished, long after they have returned to rooms that hold less air and more labor. The house keeps its perfume like a promise it intends to keep. So the day proceeds, a woman walks, and her passage is a fragrance. She sits, and the chair inherits a little of it. She speaks, and the air between faces draws closer without admitting what it contains. If there is heat beneath the collar, the bottle answers. If a glove begins to tell its own story, a cloud of scent persuades it to be quiet. The surface is managed, the surface is enough. Appearance is not merely appearance when it is required. It becomes a form of care that points away from the wet, from the troublesome, from the work that water would demand. To be perfumed is to be complete for an hour, then complete again for the next. The rooms hold the proof curtains exhaling the day before yesterday's roses. Bed sheets carrying a ghost of lavender into sleep. The illusion is strong because it lives everywhere at once, on skin and fabric in halls, where footsteps sound soft, because the air is already heavy. By evening, the bottles are no lighter. A few drops have gone, and yet the room seems fuller. She slips the stopper back into place and hears the small, final click. In the glass, the reflection looks finished, not bright with water, but composed in fragrance. Beyond the window, the city is thick with its own smells. Inside, the perfume answers, and the house believes itself safe. Tomorrow, the cloth will sting again. Tomorrow, the bottles will rise to their work. Between them, a life is kept tidy, a surface polished without a basin ever filling. The scent will announce what must be believed, that what covers can cleanse, that what lingers can protect, that a cloud of flowers is better than a stream of water. In this time, in these rooms, that belief rules the air. The morning grows brighter, but it is not light alone that fills the room. It is fragrance layer upon layer, declaring who belongs and who does not. In Victorian street, scent is more than ornament. It is a social boundary, invisible yet powerful. To be perfumed is to be respectable. To lack it is to risk exposure. A woman may walk with her head high, but if the air around her is plain, the whispers will follow. Perfume has become its own form of currency. Imported bottles from France or Italy are not merely pleasant, they are statements. A single drop carries with it the idea of refinement, of families who can afford what others cannot. To walk into a room and leave a cloud of roses or lavender is to announce status without a word. Even those who never speak of such things can smell the difference. The poor are revealed not by their clothes alone, but by their scent or their lack of it. Sweat betrays them. The sharpness of labor, the closeness of crowded rooms, the animal tang of untreated leather shoes, all of it lingers. No amount of soap already distrusted can undo the odor of poverty. In drawing rooms, this difference is magnified. The perfumed woman is greeted with smiles, her presence accepted at once. The one who carries only her body's truth risks mockery, even rejection. It is a cruel hierarchy carried on the air. A girl of modest means may borrow a ribbon or a dress, but perfume cannot be borrowed so easily. A bottle is too costly, too rare. Without it, her effort shows through. The difference between rose water and plain water becomes the difference between belonging and being dismissed. Society's demands are not written, but they are breathed in every parlor and carriage. At gatherings, the distinction grows stronger still. Families who pride themselves on refinement make certain that fragrance is present not only on bodies but in the very walls and curtains. Perfume is stitched into the fabric of the home so that even the furniture seems to speak of wealth. To visit such a place is to step into a cloud of authority. Guests leave carrying traces of it on their own garments, a lingering reminder of status they cannot keep. Children are not spared these lessons. Even young girls learn the value of scent early. They watch their mothers touch wrists with drops of oil, see them carry small bottles in handbags or pouches. Soon they mimic the gesture, dabbing lightly on their own skin, even before they understand what it means. To them, perfume is as natural as combing the hair or tying the bodice. It becomes a part of identity, a step in the long preparation for womanhood. The bottles themselves serve as decoration placed openly on dressers where visitors might glimpse them. They shine in glass trays, each one a quiet boast. To own them is to prove one's place in society. Even when the liquid inside dwindles, the bottle remains displayed like a trophy suggesting refinement long after the last drop has gone. Yet refinement comes with its own burdens. To maintain it requires vigilance. A woman who dares to appear without perfume is seen as careless, even if her gown is flawless and her manners perfect. Respectability has become tied not to true cleanliness, but to the illusion of it carried in clouds of jasmine, rose, or musk. Without it, her reputation may falter. Servants as always carry the weight of this expectation. They polish bottles, refill atomizers, and prepare scented cloths. Their hands smell of perfume long after the tasks are done, though none of the fragrance belongs to them. They know well that their own bodies are judged differently, their labor masking them in sweat that no one pretends is elegant. Still, they preserve the illusion for their mistresses because the illusion must survive at all costs. In ballrooms, the competition of scent becomes nearly overwhelming. Dozens of perfumes clash, each stronger than the last, each attempting to claim the air. Wealthier women favor complex blends heavy with imported oils. Poorer guests wear cheaper imitations, sharp and uneven. But once mingled, the distinction blurs. The air grows thick, oppressive, until the scent is no longer pleasant, but suffocating. Still, no one dares to speak. To complain would be to question the very standard everyone has agreed upon. There is irony here. The very perfume meant to elevate often collapses into chaos when gathered together. Yet society insists on reading it as elegance. To faint in such a room is not considered an insult to the conditions, but a charming weakness quickly remedied with vinegar and silence. The illusion holds no matter the cost, and so the cycle continues. Bottles are emptied and refilled. Curtains hold fragrance longer than the people who pass them. Streets carry clouds that drift between carriages. And beneath it all, the truth remains unspoken. The scent does not cleanse it, only disguises. Poverty smells honest, wealth smells composed, but neither is truly clean. This distinction enforced by perfume is as rigid as any law. It shapes daily life, guiding how people move, how they present themselves, how they are judged without a word. To be fragrant is to be seen. To lack it is to be dismissed. The illusion is stronger than truth, and society breathes it willingly day after day. The parlor is closed tight against the morning chill. Heavy drapes shut out what little sunlight might filter through soot-stained glass, and the windows remain locked, as they nearly always do, for fear of miasma drifting in from the streets. Inside, the air is still heavy with its own secrets, but soon it begins to change, thickening under the ritual that has become second nature to every household. She lifts a small cut glass bottle and squeezes the stopper. A mist rises, clings for a moment in the shaft of weak light, and then sinks into the folds of velvet curtains. Another bottle follows lavender this time, sprayed over the sofa where visitors will sit. The fragrance does not float away. It gathers. It clings. Layer upon layer, each day repeating the one before, until fabric itself seems less like cloth and more like a sponge saturated with perfume. In drawing rooms across the city, the same scene repeats. Perfume does not remain confined to the skin. It saturates the space where people live, sleep, and entertain. Table linens carry it, chair cushions drink it in, and bed sheets become fragrant long after their last washing. At first, the scents are distinct rose musk jasmine, but quickly they blur together into a heavy, cloying fog. When guests arrive, they step into that fog, swallowing it along with their greetings. At gatherings, this air becomes unbearable. Curtains closed, lamps burning, dozens of bodies pressed together. The perfumes of women clash in the heat until the air seems to shimmer with sweetness that is no sweetness at all. The fragrance settles on the tongue, a taste more than a smell, and breath grows shallow. Still, no one opens a window. To invite fresh air would be to risk illness or worse, to suggest that the household is careless with propriety. Politeness demands endurance. A lady does not cough into her handkerchief even as her eyes water. A gentleman does not wrinkle his nose though the mix of floral oils, sweat, and smoke presses into his lungs. They speak softly, bow politely, and pretend that the air does not choke them. To complain would be rude in admission that refinement has failed, and so the silence holds heavy as the perfume itself. The irony is sharp. Perfume was meant to separate the refined from the vulgar, to create distance from filth and decay. Yet in these closed rooms it becomes suffocating, more oppressive than the very air it was meant to improve. Guests smile thinly, fanning themselves as if warmth alone were the problem. Conversations continue. Laughter fills the space and the illusion of grace survives. But beneath it, lungs strain and heads grow light. When the evening ends and doors finally open, the air outside feels cold and almost raw. Guests breathe deeply, grateful though they will not say it aloud. Clothing carries the house's perfume homeward, clinging to fabric for days, a reminder of the gathering long after memory of the conversation fades. What lingers is not wit or music, but the suffocating embrace of a room drenched in scent. Servants know this reality better than anyone. They are the ones ordered to spray curtains and linens, to refresh sofas with lavender water, to carry trays through parlors where the air is already too thick to breathe easily. Their bodies accustomed to labor grow weary not from weight, but from atmosphere. They sleep at night with perfume still in their throats while their mistresses dream in the very clouds they command. The house itself becomes a participant in the illusion. Walls hold the fragrance, carpets exhale it when walked upon, and pillows release it each time a head presses down. Rooms are no longer neutral spaces. They are scented theaters where every surface plays its part. Guests walk through these theaters and understand their role to endure, to admire, to add their own fragrance to the collection. And so gatherings continue polite and suffocating. The silence surrounding discomfort is as rigid as the silence surrounding every other aspect of hygiene. To say the air is too heavy would be as indecent as to mention the sweat beneath a gown or the lice beneath a coiffure. Better to faint gracefully revived by a cloth dipped in vinegar than to admit what everyone knows. Appearance must remain intact, even if lungs burn. When the guests depart and the lamps are extinguished, the rooms remain dense with fragrance. Curtains breathe it into the night. Carpets hold it like soil holds rain. The illusion of elegance does not fade with the company. It lingers in the empty space as if to remind the house itself of its duty. The scent is not merely decoration. It is the air of respectability, a performance that never ends. The child stands beside the dressing table, small hands folded, watching. She is quiet, but her eyes follow each movement with care. Her mother holds the stopper of a glass vial, dabs the liquid against her own wrist, then touches it lightly behind the ear. The motion is practiced almost ceremonial. For the child, it is a lesson given without words. When the moment comes, a tiny square of cloth is offered. The girl mimics what she has seen. She lifts the cloth to her face, pretends to press fragrance against her cheek, and looks into the mirror. No one laughs. This is not play, not in the Victorian home. It is preparation. Every small gesture rehearses the role she will one day perform without thinking. Perfume is not taught the way reading is taught with books and lessons. It is absorbed through the rhythm of the household. Bottles standing in a row, handkerchiefs scented, and folded shawls laid across chairs with a faint halo of lavender. These are the textbooks of her education. Before she can spell the word refinement, she knows its scent. To dab perfume on the wrist is to signal belonging. It is a rule enforced not with punishments, but with silences. Girls who grow without the habit will find themselves marked. A plain-smelling presence in a parlor is noticed, though no one speaks it aloud. A raised eyebrow a step back, a conversation that drifts elsewhere. This is how society reminds her. The child learns this before she can name it. On dressing tables, bottles shine like small treasures. Their stoppers are cut to catch light, their shapes elegant, their labels printed with French words. A household that can display them on a tray near the mirror shows itself at once. Visitors see not only the glass but the promise it carries. This family is refined. This daughter will be prepared. Even empty bottles are kept placed where they can be admired as if the ghost of their fragrance were enough. The child practices with ribbons tying them as her mother does. She dabs the edge of a scarf with diluted scent, lifts it to her face, and breathes in with solemnity. Already she is absorbing the unspoken command the body must never be left to itself. Natural odor is shameful. Fragrance is discipline. To neglect this ritual would be to invite humiliation. Perfume becomes more than smell. It is character, respectability, even morality. Women speak of it in whispers, not as luxury, but as necessity. Without it, a woman is unfinished, her presence unpolished. Children hearing these whispers grow into the certainty that to smell of anything but roses or lavender is to risk disgrace. Even in poorer homes, the lesson reaches. A single small vial, perhaps refilled with diluted alcohol and a few drops of oil, is guarded carefully. Mothers show daughters how to stretch it. Dab lightly, use a cloth share between sisters. The result may be faint, but it is better than nothing. The absence of perfume would announce poverty too loudly. Better to have a whisper of scent than silence. For wealthier families, the ritual expands. Girls are introduced to perfumes as gifts, each bottle chosen with care. At birthdays or holidays, they are presented with delicate flacons as though receiving both fragrance and future. To use them is to prove maturity. To use them correctly, sparingly, but effectively is to prove refinement. The lesson is not simply about beauty, it is about control. A girl learns early that her presence is not her own. It is read and judged by others. Perfume is her defense. It tells a story before she speaks, protecting her from suspicion, from whispers of uncleanliness. The story may be false, but it is powerful, and so she repeats what she has seen, dab, press, smile, until it becomes second nature. Servants stand nearby, silent teachers in their own way. They refill bottles, prepare cloths, wipe away spills. They see the rituals reach into childhood, but they do not comment. Their own daughters may not have such bottles, but they know the weight of appearances. They too understand the difference between a girl who carries fragrance and one who does not. In the evenings when families gather, the children join in the ritual without being told. A young girl might dab her handkerchief with rose water, just enough to carry a suggestion of sweetness into the parlor. She sits quietly, her presence masked by fragrance, her role rehearsed for the years ahead. No one praises her directly, but the silence is approval. She has done what is expected, and so the cycle continues. Mothers pass the ritual to daughters as naturally as they pass gowns or jewelry. Generations inhale the same scents, trust the same illusions, and repeat the same gestures. For a Victorian woman, refinement begins long before she is grown. It begins in the cradle of fragrance, where every drop of perfume is not only a mask, but a map of the life she is expected to live. Beneath the gleam of polished shoes and the shimmer of silk skirts lay a truth rarely spoken. A Victorian woman dressed not in one garment but in many. Layers upon layers swaddled the body, a chemise pressed close to the skin drawers or petticoats folded over, that a corset tightened above, then additional skirts and gowns piled in heavy succession. At a glance, the silhouette suggested elegance, modesty, and discipline. But beneath the body told another story, one of sweat friction and a constant breeding ground for filth. The chemise worn directly against the flesh absorbed the day's first burden. Sweat collected quickly in its threads, especially beneath arms and at the small of the back, where corset bones pressed and heat had no escape. The fabric was rarely washed daily. Often it was worn for several days, sometimes longer, before laundering was considered. Its task was to act as barrier, and once it was soiled, it was still expected to serve. Above it, petticoats gathered dust from the streets, brushing against cobblestones, collecting horse manure, ash, and mud with every step. They grew heavy as the day passed, their hems darkening their folds, stiffening with what they had gathered from the outside world. Yet they were not washed frequently. Instead, they were shaken, perfumed, or patched with lace where stains appeared a disguise rather than a cleaning. The corset added another complication. Laced tightly, it pressed sweat deeper into the layers beneath. It rubbed skin raw where edges cut into flesh, creating sores that festered unseen. Washing a corset was rare. The stiffened materials made with whalebone or steel could not easily endure water. Instead, they were wiped lightly with cloths or brushed with perfume, leaving behind the illusion of freshness. In truth, they carried the imprint of weeks, even months of wear. Together, these garments created an environment where bacteria flourished. Heat built within the folds, moisture had nowhere to go, and the body was forced to sit inside its own damp enclosure. A gown might shimmer with ribbons and lace, but underneath the air was thick and stale. Servants knew this truth most clearly. When undressing their mistresses at night, they peeled away each layer, encountering garments heavy with sweat, stiff with dust, and sour with odor. They rarely commented. To remark on it would be to break the silence that society demanded. The outward layers meant for public admiration were no cleaner. Dresses were made of wool, silk, or cotton fabrics that did not forgive neglect. Yet they too were rarely washed. Their weight and delicacy made laundering an ordeal that could consume days. Instead, the gowns were aired out by hanging them near open windows, though windows themselves were often shut against feared miasmas. Stains were covered, not removed. Odors were masked, not erased. In summer, the suffering grew worse. Under layers of cloth, sweat streamed down back-soaked waistbands and pooled at elbows and knees. Women endured rashes where fabric chafed. Still, modesty demanded layers and propriety demanded silence. Even in the sweltering months, the gowns remained. The corsets tightened, the chemises unchanged. To speak of discomfort was to risk appearing weak. To complain was to appear unrefined. Public spaces amplified the issue. In crowded theaters and carriages and parlors packed with visitors, the mingled odors of sweat and perfume rose together. The heavy sweetness of rosewater clashed with the sharpness of unwashed fabric, creating an atmosphere that both suffocated and disguised. People inhaled, smiled, and pretended refinement, though everyone knew the truth of what lingered just beneath. For the women themselves, there was no easy escape. Daily bathing was distrusted, and clothing offered little relief. The body became trapped in its own costume, a costume that society insisted was necessary for respectability. Beneath the lace and silks, beneath the applause of appearances, the skin itched, burned, and suffered. Yet silence held firm. No one spoke of sores from corsets of gowns that had not been washed in months, of petticoats stiff with street filth. To acknowledge these things would have been to tear a hole in the fabric of propriety itself. So the ritual endured. Each morning the same layers were drawn up and fastened. Each evening the same garments were peeled away and hung or folded for another day. The illusion remained intact, a world of elegance, modesty, and discipline wrapped tightly around a body slowly suffocating beneath the weight of its own disguise. The body beneath Victorian fashion bore a burden that few dared to admit. Every layer added not only weight, but also confinement. A woman's gown might appear graceful as she crossed a drawing room or stepped from a carriage, but the effort to maintain that image was immense. Beneath the silks and velvets lay structures of control corsets laced, until breathing grew shallow skirts so wide that walking required calculation fabric so heavy that heat gathered with no escape. Corsets were central to this ritual of restraint. Boned with whalebone or stiffened with steel, they clamped tightly around the ribs, pressing inward until the waist shrank to the fashionable measure. For some, that meant faintness after a few steps. For others, bruises and raw flesh where the edges cut into skin. Doctors warned of lungs compressed, stomachs displaced, and organs forced from their natural positions. But the warnings rarely found sympathetic ears. To endure was to prove refinement. In summer, the suffering deepened. A corset trapped heat against the body, preventing sweat from evaporating. Moisture gathered in the folds of chemises and petticoats, soaking seams until they rubbed painfully. Under the arms and at the waist, rashes bloomed red and raw. Yet these discomforts were hidden. To acknowledge them would mean revealing the truth beneath the gown. And truth in this world was less valuable than appearance. The gowns themselves were often made of thick fabrics, wool for warmth, silk for splendor, cotton for structure. Each absorbed sweat and dust with ease, yet released nothing. Women carried with them not only the weight of their garments, but also the day's accumulation of filth pressed into every thread. Still, to appear in fewer layers would have been scandalous. Modesty demanded coverage. Society demanded silence. On crowded streets, the burden became nearly unbearable. Carriages splashed mud. Coal dust floated from chimneys. The hems of skirts swept all of it up, dragging through the day and returning home laden with grime. Yet these skirts were rarely washed. Servants shook them, brushed them, or simply hung them to air. The filth remained disguised with lace or ribbons. The illusion of freshness mattered more than the reality. Even indoors, the garments gave little relief. Parlors heated by fireplaces trapped warmth, while closed windows kept air stagnant. Women sat upright corsets, unyielding gowns, pressing inward. Sweat collected quietly, absorbed by fabrics that would not be washed for weeks. They fanned themselves with delicate motions, smiling through discomfort, pretending refinement was effortless. But beneath the surface, their bodies begged for release. Servants saw this reality most clearly. At day's end, when the gowns were unlaced and folded away, they were left with the task of tending the garments. They touched sweat-damp corsets, lifted skirts heavy with dirt, and smelled the odor hidden under layers of perfume. Their work was to maintain appearances even when the truth clung plainly to the fabric in their hands. They bore the weight of both the clothing and the silence. Society praised the silhouette as graceful, the layers as modest, the corset as virtuous discipline. But for the women themselves, each day was a negotiation with discomfort. To walk was to calculate balance under layers. To sit was to endure pressure on ribs and stomach. To breathe was to accept tightness. To complain was to risk shame. In this way, fashion became not only a display of beauty, but also a quiet endurance test. Women carried the proof of their refinement on their very bodies, marked by fainting spells, rashes, and shallow breaths. They bore the suffering without words, convinced that to sacrifice health was a fair price for elegance. The gowns glimmered, the corsets sculpted, the ribbons fluttered. But beneath all of it lay a truth no one named: the human body was suffocating in silence, wrapped tightly in the fabric of its own illusions. Even when the body cried out beneath its layers, society had already devised its solution: more perfume. If sweat soaked through chemises and corsets, if petticoats grew stiff with dirt, if gowns absorbed the sour weight of the day, the answer was never water. It was always fragrance. Bottles stood ready on every dressing table, and their contents were pressed into service as often as needed. The ritual was simple. When a gown began to betray its secrets, a servant sprayed or dabbed perfume directly onto the fabric. Underarms, collars, and hems received the heaviest attention, where sweat and odor collected most. The fragrance did not erase the smell, it only cloaked it, turning human odor into a sharper, more complex mix. Sweat plus rosewater mildew plus lavender. The result was overwhelming. In crowded theaters, the effect multiplied. Dozens of women, each carrying their own private battles with filth, sat shoulder to shoulder in dresses sprayed again and again. The perfume lifted in waves as bodies shifted, mingling into clouds that settled over the room. To some it was suffocating. To others it was simply the smell of society. Either way, it was endured. Politeness demanded silence. Carriages were worse still. In the narrow space, passengers sat pressed together. Heavy gowns filled the air with mingled scents, musk, jasmine, lilac, each fighting to conceal what lay beneath. Sweat trapped beneath corsets and petticoats leaked steadily into fabric. The perfumes layered one on top of another did not disguise the odor, they magnified it. A sour sweetness clung to the air until the carriage itself seemed perfumed. Servants knew the truth most intimately. They were tasked with reviving garments that had long since ceased to be clean. Each evening they lifted gowns damp with sweat-spraying perfume to disguise what could not be washed away. Their hands reeked of alcohol and oils long after the work was finished. They scraped mud from hems and rubbed fragrant cloths across collars, hoping to satisfy mistresses who demanded elegance but refused true laundering. The result was a cycle that never broke. Fabric became heavier with each day, absorbing both filth and fragrance. Perfume seeped into fibers until the smell of roses and sweat could not be separated. Gowns carried these odors into parlors, into ballrooms, into bedrooms, where windows stayed closed. The scent was everywhere, undeniable, yet never acknowledged aloud. Visitors learned to endure. To comment on the odor would be impolite, to wrinkle the nose vulgar. Better to smile, to bow, to pretend that the mixture of perfume and filth was refinement itself. Silence made the illusion possible, and the illusion was all that mattered. The irony was sharp. What began as an effort to hide filth created its own stench stronger and more inescapable than sweat alone. Yet in the Victorian mind, the presence of perfume was always preferable to its absence. To smell only of the body was shame. To smell of perfume, no matter how heavy, was grace. Thus the cycle continued. Filth-concealed odor magnified, silence preserved. Beneath lace and ribbons, beneath polite conversation and soft laughter, society breathed air thick with its own denial. And every gown that swayed through a drawing room carried with it a secret no one dared to name. At the close of each day, gowns were not washed. They were never meant to be. Instead, they were treated with small gestures, half measures that created the illusion of freshness without ever achieving it. A hem caked with mud was brushed lightly and left to dry. A collar darkened with sweat was dabbed with a cloth dipped in vinegar or perfume. Skirts were shaken out near open windows, though windows themselves were rarely opened wide enough to allow real air. The logic was simple: gowns were too heavy, too costly, too delicate to be washed often. A full cleaning required servants to haul buckets, heat water, and scrub by hand for hours. Wet fabrics grew heavier, straining arms and backs, and took days to dry in the damp English climate. Most households chose avoidance. They hung garments on lines or over chairs, letting wind or candlelight touch them, as if air itself could erase what clung to the fabric. Stains were managed with concealment rather than removal. A wine spill on a bodice might be covered with lace. Grease marks near the waist could be hidden with a sash. Muddy hems were disguised by pinning ribbons just above them, drawing the eye away. Dirt was not banished. It was transformed into ornament. Women wore their disguises, proudly confident that no one would dare look closely enough to see the truth. Inner garments fared no better. Chemises and drawers pressed against the body all day were expected to carry sweat oils and odor for many days before being replaced. Laundering them was laborious, and water still carried its stigma. So they were left reused again and again, perfumed and powdered, but rarely truly cleaned. In ballrooms and theaters, the truth became inescapable. The air was thick with perfume, but beneath it another layer lingered the sour tang of fabric that had been worn for weeks of sweat, pressed into seams of hems that had swept the city's filth. Guests smelled it. Servants smelled it. Yet silence prevailed. To name the odor would have been to break the fragile illusion that society relied upon. At-home gowns were stored carefully, but not cleanly. Wardrobes closed tightly around them, trapping both fragrance and filth. Moths found their way into folds, feeding quietly on sweat-stained fabric. Servants shook garments to drive insects out, then folded them again, as though nothing had happened. Mistresses wore them without question the next evening. The cycle seemed endless. A gown was worn until disguise failed, until ribbons and perfume could no longer mask the dirt. Only then would it be washed, a monumental event that consumed servants' days. Buckets were carried soap, scraped against cloth water darkened with filth. Hands blistered and backs ached. Yet even this washing was not thorough. Heavy fabrics held their secrets deep within fibers. By the time a gown dried, it already carried the ghost of its own odor. Doctors occasionally warned of rashes and infections caused by unwashed garments. Women came to them with sores beneath corsets, redness along seams, itching in folds where fabric rubbed too long. But such warnings held little weight against fashion and propriety. Better to suffer in silence than to admit that elegance carried filth. For wealthier families, the illusion was easier to maintain. They owned more gowns rotating them, so no single dress bore the burden of daily wear. Yet the result was the same. A wardrobe of unwashed gowns was no cleaner than a single one worn again and again. For poorer families, the truth was harsher still. With only one or two dresses, women wore the same garment, day after day repairing it, as it frayed, perfuming it until bottles were empty. To modernize, it seems absurd women covering stains with lace disguising sweat, with roses dragging skirts through streets and calling them refined. Yet in their world, this was practicality. Washing risked ruining a fabric while appearance demanded perfection. Between those two forces, the choice was clear. The gown survived, the body beneath endured. And so evenings closed with gowns hung carefully in wardrobes, still carrying the day's sweat and dust. Servants folded inner garments stiff with use. Bottles of perfume stood ready for the next morning. The silence remained intact. No one admitted what everyone knew: refinement was only an illusion, stitched together with ribbons, lace, and denial. When the time finally came to wash a gown, the household shifted into quiet labor. This was not a daily or even weekly routine. It was an event, one that disrupted schedules and left servants aching long after the task was done. The mistress might sigh over a stained hem or a bodice gone dull, then order a full cleaning. From that moment, the burden fell entirely on the hands of others. First, buckets of water were carried in, one after another, sloshing and heavy. Fires were stoked, kettles boiled, and the water poured into basins large enough to hold skirts that weighed nearly as much as the girl scrubbing them. Soap, harsh and foul-smelling, was scraped across the fabric, leaving behind streaks of lye that burned the skin of the washer as much as it attacked the dirt. Servants leaned into their workbacks, bent arms trembling steam, rising around them in clouds that clung to their hair and lungs. The gowns resisted every stroke. Silk and velvet drank in the water, but gave up little of the sweat and perfume ground deep into their fibers. Feathered trims and lace sagged fragile and heavy, threatening to tear under the strain. Stains that had been hidden with ribbons now bled into the water, spreading rather than vanishing. The labor was endless, and yet it could not undo weeks of neglect. Once rinsed, the true challenge began. Wet gowns were monstrously heavy, weighing several stone, and lifting them demanded strength that most maids barely possessed. 2 or 3 women hauled each garment out of the water, their arms raw from soap, their breath sharp in their throats. They wrung what they could, then draped the fabric across lines or racks where it hung sodden, dripping for days. Rooms became damp caves filled with the sour scent of wet cloth mixed with coal smoke. Drying did not mean restoration. Fabrics stiffened, colors dulled, seams strained. A gown that entered the wash rarely emerged the same. This was why women resisted cleaning them at all. To preserve a garment's beauty was to keep it from water. And so, between rare washings, they relied on perfume and decoration, sacrificing hygiene for the illusion of preservation. Servants bore the physical cost. Their backs ached from hauling, their fingers cracked from lye, their lungs burned from steam. Yet their effort was invisible. A mistress wore her freshly washed gown to a gathering, smiling as if elegance had come effortlessly, never acknowledging the exhaustion woven into every thread. The illusion was intact, and that was all that mattered. For the women who wore these gowns, the consequences of neglect grew clear over time. Fabrics pressed against the skin carried bacteria and dirt day after day. Rashes bloomed in the folds of the waist under arms along thighs where damp cloth rubbed. Infections spread quietly, mistaken for the natural price of womanhood. Few connected the sores and itching to the gowns themselves. After all, gowns were symbols of refinement. They could not also be agents of harm. Doctors warned occasionally, but their voices were faint against the louder chorus of tradition. They spoke of scalded skin, from harsh soaps of lung troubles, from perfumed powders of rashes that might be avoided with frequent washing. But the advice rarely traveled far. It was easier to blame illness on weak constitutions or bad air than to admit that clothing itself carried disease. Among the wealthy, wardrobes softened the burden. With dozens of gowns, a woman could set aside one dress and wear another, giving the illusion of variety and freshness. Yet these gowns too were washed only rarely. They were perfumed, patched, and rotated, but never cleansed. Filth spread evenly through abundance, just as it did through scarcity. Among the poor, the problem was more brutal. A woman with only 2 or 3 gowns wore each until it was stiff with sweat and grime. Repairs were made, ribbons, shifted perfumes, stretched thin. When the dress could no longer be hidden, it was washed with the same back-breaking labor, but without the luxury of servants to share the task. Mothers and daughters bent over basins themselves, their fingers raw, their bodies trembling, their homes filled with steam and sour damp. The cycle was unyielding. Filth accumulated, was disguised, then returned in greater strength. Washings broke fabric down, shortened a gown's life, and brought misery to those who performed them. Yet appearances demanded that gowns remain splendid, even if their splendor was only surface deep. Women wore them proudly, servants cleaned them desperately, and silence preserved the illusion. When a woman entered a ballroom, her dress shimmered beneath candlelight. Lace sparkled, ribbons gleamed, and perfume rose like incense. No one spoke of the sores beneath her corset, the sweat woven into her skirt, or the hours of labor spent wringing the cloth. Elegance appeared complete. Health was left behind. The contradictions of Victorian cleanliness were never sharper than in the bath. To the modern eye, a bath suggests fresh water, soap, and relief. But in a world without plumbing, with water drawn from wells fouled by sewage and tubs that held heat, only briefly bathing was less a renewal than a burden. The tub itself was a heavy thing, wood bound with iron or tin, beaten into shape, or copper, lined for those with means. It was dragged into a kitchen or a bedroom, placed near a fire if one was burning. Then came the work. Bucket after bucket of water was carried in from pumps or wells, heated in kettles and poured carefully into the tub. Servants performed this labor bent double with each trip, arms straining, backs aching. By the time the tub was half filled, steam already curled around the rafters. But the bath was not for the servants who prepared it. It was for the family, beginning with the father, then the mother, then the children in order of age. Each entered the same water, gray by the second use, murky by the third. By the time the youngest child stepped in the tub, it was a broth of soap, scum, hair, sweat, and dirt scraped from every body before. Yet this was considered sufficient. A weekly bath was more than many dared hope for. The water itself was never clean. Drawn from rivers where waste was dumped or wells near cesspits, it often arrived already tainted. Beetles, larvae, and worms floated in it, scooped aside with a casual hand before a body lowered in. Soap made from animal fat, and ash added its own rancid smell. What clung to the skin after bathing was less freshness than a residue of film of grease powder and whatever else the water carried. For the wealthy, marble bathrooms and porcelain tubs were symbols of refinement, but even there, superstition held sway. Doctors warned that too much bathing weakened the constitution, stripping vital oils or opening the body to chills. A weekly bath was considered more than adequate. For many, monthly was enough. In poorer households where tubs were scarce, washing was done with a rag. In a basin, a dab at the face, hands, and neck, nevermore. The ritual of bathing when it occurred was exhausting. Filling the tub took hours. Emptying it was no easier, each bucket of foul water carried out and dumped. The house remained damp steam, condensing on walls mold encouraged to grow in corners. Yet families persevered, convinced that this rare ceremony marked them as modern, refined, and healthy. Servants bore the humiliation of proximity. They scrubbed the tubs after each use, scraping away the filth their employers left behind. Often they themselves were denied the same luxury expected, instead to wash quickly with cold water from a jug, or with no water at all. The division was cruelly clear: refinement was not for those who labored to produce it. Children suffered most. Their turn came last when the water was at its foulest, and they sat obediently while mothers insisted that cleanliness had been achieved. Rashes and infections spread, though no one connected them to the bath itself. Illness was blamed on weak constitutions, not on the shared stew in which the family soaked. The irony was sharp. Bathing meant to cleanse, often introduced more filth than it removed, yet it endured as ritual. The act itself was enough. To lower the body into water, however dirty was, to perform refinement. To endure the discomfort was to prove propriety. And so the tubs remained heavy and gray, waiting each week for the cycle to begin again. When steam lifted into the rafters and water cooled to a sluggish chill, families rose believing themselves cleaner. Clothes went back on, perfumes were applied, and the illusion carried forward into the day. Behind them, servants bent once more to buckets hauling away what refinement had left behind. In parlors and drawing rooms, no one spoke of the bathwater of the insects skimmed aside or of the children shivering in filth. Silence held as it did with every other part of hygiene. To question the ritual was to risk ridicule. Better to endure, better to pretend, better to call filth refinement than to admit the truth. When the tubs were drained and put away, the question of odor did not vanish. It lingered in clothes worn too long, in shoes that trapped sweat in the very air of houses, closed against fresh breezes. For women whose appearance was judged more strictly than men's, this problem demanded constant attention. And so they turned to other remedies, improvised and desperate, pressed into service as substitutes for true washing. Among the strangest of these were the makeshift deodorants of ash and herbs. Fireplaces offered an endless supply of fine gray ash, swept up each morning by servants. What was meant to be discarded found a new purpose. Women sprinkled it into shoes, rubbed it lightly into stockings, or dusted it beneath corsets. Ash absorbed moisture or seemed to leaving behind a dryness that felt like cleanliness. But the illusion was short-lived. Ash clung stubbornly to fabric-staining stockings with gray streaks that ground into the skin. It irritated open pores rubbed against blisters and left small sores raw and stinging. Still, the ritual continued. To step into shoes freshly filled with ash was thought to be a mark of refinement, though the result was far from elegant. Bay leaves, too, were called upon. Dried, crumbled, or sewn into little sachets, they were tucked into gowns, slipped into pockets, or pressed between layers of fabric. At first, the leaves gave off a faint sweetness, an herbal fragrance that promised to mask odor, but sweat quickly mixed with the scent, turning it sour. Within hours, the sachets smelled less like spice and more like rot. Yet the custom endured. Better to wear the sourness of bay leaves than to risk the sharper odor of the body itself. Shoes became some of the dirtiest places for these experiments. Stockings damp with sweat pressed tightly into stiff leather boots created an environment where odor thrived. Ash poured directly inside mixed with sweat until it formed a paste caking the soles and sides. Removing boots at the end of the day released a stench that perfume could not conquer. Servants tasked with cleaning scraped the gray residue from leather, and cloth hands coated with the mess their mistresses left behind. Servants bore the brunt of every improvisation. They gathered ash from hearths, sifted it fine, and prepared sachets of herbs. They washed garments streaked with gray-aired shoes, heavy with sourness, and carried the smell on their hands long after their work was done. Yet they never spoke. To comment would have been to break propriety. Silence protected the household's dignity, even when servants themselves endured the worst of the filth. These methods were passed from one generation to the next, taught as wisdom rather than desperation. Mothers told daughters to dust shoes with ash, to tuck herbs into corsets, to trust the rituals of those who came before. Rarely did anyone ask if they worked. What mattered was that they were practiced, that the effort itself was proof of refinement. But the truth could not be hidden. Guests in drawing rooms sometimes caught the sour edge of damp herbs, the acrid trace of ash mixed with sweat. They noticed, but politeness demanded silence. To mention the smell would have been vulgar and insult to the household, and so the illusion remained intact, upheld by courtesy as much as by ritual. In the end, ash and bay leaves did not cleanse. They did not even conceal. They transformed odor into something new, neither natural nor pleasant, but acceptable only because society agreed to ignore it. To the women who used them, these makeshift remedies were shields against shame. To those who smelled them, they were reminders of a culture where appearance outweighed truth. The fireplace ash, the sachets of bay leaves, the sour paste in shoes, all became part of the daily rhythm of Victorian life. They preserved the illusion of refinement even as they deepened discomfort, and in the silence of parlors and bedrooms, no one admitted what everyone knew: these rituals brought no cleanliness, only another layer of denial. Morning light spilled into the dressing room, but the air was already hazy with dust. On the table lay small boxes of powder ivory, rose pale gray, each filled with a substance more dangerous than its owner knew. Victorian women relied upon these powders as much as they relied on corsets or perfume. To step into society with an unpowdered face was unthinkable. Pale skin was the mark of refinement. Powder provided it when nature did not. The ritual looked graceful. A brush swept across the face, leaving behind a cloud that glittered briefly in the light before it vanished. A puff along the neck, a stroke across the chest, sometimes a full dusting down the arms. To the mirror, the result was elegant skin, smooth, pale, and seemingly untouched by sweat or sun. But what the mirror could not show was what entered the body with every breath. The powders were not gentle. Made from chalk, clay, gypsum, or even plaster of Paris, they carried sharp edges at a microscopic level. When inhaled, these grains scraped at the throat, lodged in the lungs, and clung stubbornly. Day after day, the body absorbed them until coughing became common. Throats grew raw and lungs weakened. Yet the habit did not falter. Beauty demanded it. Perfumed powders were considered most desirable, their harsh dust mixed with oils or dried flowers. A box of lavender-scented powder was thought to mark sophistication, while rose powder suggested delicacy. But the fragrance only deepened the harm. Each application filled bedrooms with heavy clouds particles, settling into curtains, carpets, and bedding. Women inhaled the very substance they trusted to protect their elegance. Servants grinding plaster into powder or cleaning away the residue breathed even more. Doctors sometimes warned against the practice. They noted persistent coughs among women, described inflamed throats, and even connected powders to cases of consumption. But their voices were faint, drowned out by fashion and silence. To abandon powder would be to risk oily skin in public, to appear common, to forfeit the fragile shield of respectability. For most women, that risk was greater than illness. The powders did more than harm the lungs. On the skin, they clogged pores mixed with sweat and created a paste that cracked and flaked. Rashes appeared, infections spread, but powders were only applied more thickly to cover them. The cycle was endless irritation disguised by the very substance that caused it: weakness, hidden beneath a mask of pale refinement. Servants endured the worst of the labor. They ground the powders, sifted them into fine dust, and filled ornate boxes. Clouds rose around them as they worked, coating their hair and throats. They coughed quietly, wiping at eyes that stung, but said nothing. Later, they wiped residue from mirrors and tables, breathing in what had already settled. Their bodies bore the damage long before their mistresses even noticed their own symptoms. The use of powders spread across class lines. Wealthy women purchased imported varieties fine as silk, heavily scented kept in jeweled boxes. Poorer women bought coarse mixtures from markets often laced with cheaper materials, chalk plaster, even lead. The results were the same. Coughs in parlors echoed coughs in crowded rooms. Powder leveled society not in elegance but in illness? Ballrooms revealed the contradiction most clearly. Hundreds of women powdered and perfumed filled the air with clouds of dust each time they adjusted their faces. The chandeliers sparkled, gowns shimmered, music played. Yet beneath the glitter throats burned lungs ached, and fainting spells grew common. Vinegar cloths revived the fallen, and still the dancing went on. To comment on the suffocating air would have been vulgar. Better to collapse silently than to break the illusion. The irony was cruel. Powders meant to create the image of health and beauty slowly destroyed both. Women coughed through dinners, wheezed through balls, and endured infections behind closed doors, all while presenting a mask of pale elegance to the world. Servants bore silent witness. Doctors spoke quietly. But society as a whole agreed to look away. And so, each morning the boxes of powder opened once more. Brushes swept faces, dust rose lungs filled. By evening the coughs returned, and by morning the ritual began again. It was not refinement, not truly. It was a slow poisoning disguised as beauty preserved by silence. Evenings brought the true theater of Victorian life. The day's small illusions perfume, dabbed behind the ear powder, brushed across the cheeks, lace pinned over stains, were meant to prepare women for this moment. Ballrooms lit by chandeliers and warmed by gaslight were where appearances were tested and measured. Here, refinement was not only seen, but also inhaled, endured, and silently judged. The halls were closed tightly against the night air. Windows stayed locked, curtains drawn, for the fear of miasma lingered in every household. Hosts believed that drafts carried illness, and so they kept the air inside sealed and still. Into this closed space pressed hundreds of bodies, each wrapped in layers of fabric, each clouded in perfume, each breathing out warmth and sweat. Within an hour, the air turned heavy, more liquid than atmosphere. Perfume meant to enchant became suffocating in such company. Dozens of fragrances mingled rose with jasmine, musk with lavender, until the scents no longer resembled flowers, but a dense fog that coated the throat. Guests swallowed the air as though drinking each breath another draught of sweetened discomfort. Sweat added its own sharpness. Wool coats, silk gowns, and velvet waistcoats absorbed it greedily, then released it into the crowd. Alcohol joined the mix, seeping from punch bowls and wine glasses, clinging to the breath of dancers. The result was unmistakable. Guests swayed, not only from music, but from the stifling air. Women fainted corsets, crushing lungs that already strained for breath. Men loosened collars discreetly, though propriety demanded composure. Servants moved quietly among them, carrying trays through the fog of perfume and sweat, their own clothes steeped in the same suffocating mixture. Fainting was treated not as a symptom, but as a scene. When a woman collapsed, she was carried to the side, revived with a cloth soaked in vinegar, then returned to the dance as though nothing had happened. No one asked why so many fainted in these rooms. To question the air was to question refinement itself. Better to admire resilience than to admit discomfort. The irony was painful. A society obsessed with purity filled its grandest rooms with suffocating air. Yet silence prevailed. Guests smiled through dizziness, bowed through nausea, and praised their hosts for elegance. Even when entire groups staggered out pale and coughing, the evening was still remembered as a triumph. The ballrooms themselves were complicit. Heavy curtains trapped dust and perfume alike. Carpets held years of filth stirred up with every step. Chandeliers glittered above clouds of smoke and scent. To admire them was to ignore the weight of the air beneath. But admiration was easier than honesty. Guests preferred to believe they were part of something splendid, even if it choked them. When the music ended and guests returned home, their gowns were damp, their hair sticky with sweat, their throats raw from breathing perfume and alcohol. Beds received them, but even there relief was scarce. Sheets rarely washed held their own odors of sweat oil and dust. The body already suffocated in the ballroom found little comfort in the bedroom. Yet the illusion endured. Hosts remembered their gatherings as brilliant successes. Guests recalled glittering chandeliers and graceful dances, not the heaviness of the air or the faintness of breath. The silence held. What mattered was not truth, but memory, not health, but appearance. And so ballrooms remained symbols of refinement. They glittered with jewels and echoed with music, while beneath their splendor they suffocated all who entered. Guests endured it, willingly convinced that suffering in silence was part of elegance. The evening ended not with freshness, but with exhaustion. Still, the story told afterward was one of beauty, grace, and triumph. The illusion was safe, and that was enough. The ballroom ended in exhaustion, but the night did not promise relief. Beds awaited, yet these sanctuaries of supposed comfort were themselves traps of filth. To the Victorian eye, a bed was a symbol of intimacy, refinement, and rest. To the body that lay upon it, it was something else entirely, a place where sweat, dust, and disease gathered silently. Sheets were heavy woven of cotton or linen and rarely changed. Washing them required hours of boiling, scrubbing, and drying, so they were left in place for weeks, sometimes months. The fabric grew stiff with sweat oils and dead skin, yet women slid between them, nightly convinced by superstition that to change linens too often would drain the body's strength. They endured the smell, and in time, they no longer noticed it. Pillows held more secrets. Hair fell upon them each night, tangling into clusters that servants sometimes plucked away, but more often ignored. Sweat darkened their centers, leaving sour patches that deepened with every use. Feathers inside absorbed the moisture, growing musty, sometimes alive with mites or fleas. Still, pillows were treasured as marks of luxury, plumped each morning, perfumed occasionally, but rarely cleaned. Mattresses were worse. Stuffed with feathers, horsehair, or straw, they absorbed everything. Sweat soaked them night after night. Fleas and bedbugs thrived within feeding as women slept. Families knew of the infestations but said nothing. To complain was to admit shame, and silence was easier. A mattress was rarely replaced. It grew heavier each year, weighed down by layers of filth that no amount of beating with sticks could remove. Pets joined in the bed too. Small dogs curled against their mistresses, cats nestled at their feet. Their fur, their fleas, their waste all mingled with the fabric already laden with human residue. This was not seen as uncleanliness, but as affection. To share a bed with a pet was a sign of gentleness, even refinement. The consequences were ignored. Servants bore the endless burden of maintaining these beds. They dragged linens to boiling cauldrons only when ordered, their arms raw from soap, their lungs filled with steam. They carried mattresses outside, beating them until clouds of dust rose into their faces, coughing as they worked. They tucked lavender sachets between sheets to disguise odor, knowing it did nothing. Still, they smiled when their mistresses praised the freshness of their rooms. Guests, too, learned the lesson of silence. To sleep in another's home was to endure the same filth quietly. Beds offered to visitors carried the odor of sweat and the crawl of unseen insects, but politeness forbade complaint. In the morning, they offered thanks, pretending rest, preserving the illusion. Doctors occasionally spoke of the dangers. They warned that unwashed beds spread rashes, infections, even respiratory disease. But their warnings fell against the wall of tradition. To strip a bed too often was believed to disturb the body's balance. Better to endure illness than to risk such disturbance. And so sheets stiffened, mattresses sagged, and silence endured. The contradiction was sharp. A society that valued propriety above all else accepted lying each night in filth. Women powdered their faces, perfumed their gowns, smiled in parlors, and then slept in beds heavy with sweat and mold. The illusion of refinement ended at the bedroom door, but the silence remained. Each morning the cycle began again. Women rose from sheets that reeked of bodies and pets dressed in gowns perfumed to disguise yesterday's sweat, and presented themselves once more as paragons of elegance. No one spoke of the odor clinging to the bed, the insects biting through the night, the stiffness of unwashed linen. To mention it would have been indecent. To ignore it was to remain respectable, and so the bed, the most private of spaces, became another stage for the same performance. Refinement was claimed, filth was endured, silence was kept. The illusion survived until morning. The silence surrounding Victorian hygiene was not confined to parlors or ballrooms. It seeped into the very fabric of private life. Nowhere was this more evident than in the matter of the body itself, its odors, its secret functions, its unspoken burdens. To be respectable meant to ignore them, to pretend they did not exist. What could not be erased was instead hidden under layers of fabric, perfume, and silence. Body odor was constant. Heavy gowns and corsets trapped sweat against the skin stockings, kept feet damp, and layers of undergarments prevented air from reaching the body. Few bathed often enough to cleanse it away. Yet in polite society, no one admitted what everyone smelled. Guests sat together in drawing rooms, heavy with the scent of perspiration. Carriages carried clouds of stale odor mixed with perfume. Still, no mention was made. To speak would have been vulgar worse than the smell itself. Menstruation was treated with the same denial. Women managed their cycles with rags of cotton or wool washed poorly and reused until they were stiff with stains. The odor could not be disguised, yet society insisted it be ignored. Servants noticed handling laundry heavy with the unmistakable marks of blood, but they too remained silent. Mothers taught daughters not to speak of it, not even to doctors. Pain was endured, privately leaks and stains were hidden, and the subject itself was erased from conversation. Hair added another layer of discomfort. Rarely washed, it carried grease and powder, a sour tang that lingered in rooms. Brushes thickened with oils and dust, yet were used repeatedly, passed even from one family member to another. Perfumed oils were applied liberally, not to cleanse, but to disguise. Heads itched with lice, scalps burned from irritation, but no one admitted it aloud. Even in the most intimate spaces, the silence held. Husbands and wives shared beds steeped in odor, yet rarely spoke of it. Families shared brushes, basins, and chamber pots, but pretended that nothing was amiss. Yes, guests endured the filth of unfamiliar homes without complaint. Servants bore the evidence, most directly laundering stained rags, shaking lice from bedding scrubbing brushes clogged with hair and grease. But they too obeyed the rule of silence. The contradiction was striking. A culture that prided itself on propriety and refinement chose denial as its highest virtue. To complain of odor or dirt was to risk being seen as coarse. To mention menstruation was to risk vulgarity. To acknowledge lice or sweat was to admit that refinement was only an illusion. Silence became the only option, a shield stronger than any soap or perfume. This silence was not passive. It was active, enforced by custom and expectation. Women smiled through discomfort. Men ignored what they could not bear. Servants bowed their heads. To speak would have been to break the spell, and the spell mattered more than truth. Refinement depended on it. Thus, day after day, the body was divided into two worlds, the visible powdered and perfumed, and the hidden damp and unwashed. One was shown proudly, the other denied. Guests pretended not to smell what filled every room. Families pretended not to notice what they endured every night. And so the silence deepened, thicker than the perfumes that tried to mask it. By the end of the century, the weight of this denial was everywhere. Parlors filled with polite conversation while sweat clung to gowns. Ballrooms glittered with chandeliers while guests fainted in suffocating air. Bedrooms offered beds that stank of mold and animals while women powdered their faces in the morning. The silence made all of it possible. It was the strongest illusion of all. What is most astonishing looking back is not the filth itself, but the pact of silence that surrounded it. The smells of sweat mildew and unwashed cloth were everywhere, yet no one spoke of them. They clung to parlors, floated in ballrooms, seeped from bedrooms, but society treated them as if they were invisible. Silence was its own form of respectability, a curtain heavier than any velvet drape. This pact bound together every class. The wealthy hid behind silk gowns and bottles of French perfume. The poor endured in cramped rooms, their few garments worn to rags. Yet both groups lived in the same haze of odor and dust. A lady in satin smelled no sweeter than a servant in cotton. Both sweated beneath the same wool corsets, both lay in beds heavy with unwashed sheets. The illusion of difference was preserved, but the reality was shared. To complain was dangerous. A guest who remarked on the smell of a drawing room risked insulting the household. A servant who admitted the stench of her mistress's gown risked dismissal. Even family members kept silent, for to acknowledge filth was to break propriety. Better to cough discreetly than to name the dust. Better to faint in a ballroom than to demand fresh air. Silence was safer than honesty. Writers and doctors occasionally pierced this quiet. Satirical magazines hinted at the absurdity of perfume replacing water. Physicians noted the connection between poor hygiene and disease. Servants whispered jokes among themselves, mocking the contradiction between elegance and odor. But these voices were faint compared to the roar of denial that filled daily life. The rules of propriety drowned out truth. Illness, when it struck, was rarely blamed on filth. Tuberculosis, rashes, chronic coughs. These were attributed to weak constitutions, bad luck, or fate. To admit they might be caused by unwashed gowns, moldy mattresses, or suffocating ballrooms would have been to admit that society itself was flawed, and that Victorian culture could not bear. It was easier to preserve the illusion than to confront the reality. Even laughter and conversation were shaped by the silence. In parlors, women fanned themselves while perfume mixed with sweat but spoke only of politics or art. In carriages, passengers shifted uncomfortably in the sour air but smiled and bowed all the same. In ballrooms, couples danced shoulder to shoulder, dripping with sweat, yet grinned as if the stench were nothing at all. Everyone knew, no one admitted. The silence itself became a kind of performance, a shared discipline as strict as any etiquette of the table or the dance floor. To remain quiet was to prove refinement. To notice nothing was to belong. To break the silence was to risk vulgarity, shame, or exclusion. And so the pact endured. What this reveals is more than neglect. It reveals a culture devoted to denial. Perfume replaced soap ribbons, replaced washing, silence replaced truth. The price was health, lungs scarred by powders, skin burned by alcohol, bodies weakened by filth. Yet the illusion of refinement survived, polished and perfumed, defended fiercely by those who suffered most beneath it. Looking back, the silence is the most telling detail of all. It shows how much people were willing to endure for appearances, how far they would go to protect the illusion of grace, and how easily suffering was hidden beneath a smile, a curtsy, a polite nod. In the end, the silence was heavier than the gowns, thicker than the perfume, stronger than the filth itself. The weight of this silence shaped every corner of Victorian life. It was not simply a refusal to speak, but a discipline learned from childhood, reinforced in every parlor, every ballroom, every bedroom. To belong in society meant to master it. A girl who wrinkled her nose at the smell of her aunt's gown was scolded into silence. A boy who asked why the sheets stank of mold was told he was rude. Children grew into adults who had learned the lesson well. Refinement was not truth, it was endurance. Even laughter conformed to this rule. In drawing rooms, women rustled their gowns and spoke of politics or novels, while the smell of sweat and powder hung around them like a curtain. They smiled, they whispered, but never admitted what they all sensed. Guests sat shoulder to shoulder in suffocating parlors, each politely ignoring the scent of unwashed carpets, curtains, and bodies. Conversation glided smoothly over the surface, never dipping into the reality beneath. The same was true in ballrooms. Couples danced in air thick with perfume and heat. Their faces flushed their clothes damp. Women fainted revived with vinegar cloths and returned to the dance as though nothing had happened. Men loosened collars discreetly, then pulled them tight again, pretending composure. The silence was louder than the music. Everyone knew, but no one dared to say. Servants carried the heaviest awareness. They handled the filth, directly scraping sweat-stained corsets, shaking lice from mattresses, cleaning perfumes that burned their hands. They saw the sores beneath gowns, the mold on toothbrushes, the ash-streaked shoes. Yet they too obeyed the silence. To speak was to risk dismissal, to lose livelihood. Better to endure quietly, even as their lungs filled with dust and their backs ached from endless labor. Doctors, when consulted, spoke carefully. A physician might hint that powders harmed the lungs or that unwashed sheets spread rashes, but he would not confront a household directly. To do so was to risk insult. Illness was attributed to fate, to weak constitutions, to the mysteries of the body. The connection to filth remained unspoken, even when it was obvious. The silence was stronger than science. What emerges from this pact is a culture built on denial. Elegance demanded the concealment of reality, and concealment demanded silence. Women endured burns from perfume and rashes from corsets. Families lay in beds heavy with sweat and dust. Guests fainted in ballrooms, revived and danced again. No one questioned the illusion because the illusion was all that held society together. In time, silence became a form of survival. To speak of odor or filth was to risk ridicule, to appear vulgar or unrefined. To remain silent was to belong. Thus the silence was not only habit, it was law unwritten but unbreakable. It preserved appearances even as it destroyed health. Looking back, it is the silence that lingers most heavily. Heavier than the gowns, thicker than the perfumes, more suffocating than the dust-filled air. It wrapped itself around every life, binding rich and poor alike. Behind portraits of pale faces and velvet gowns lay unwashed bodies, unventilated rooms and illnesses born in silence. Victorian hygiene was not simply about neglect. It was about the refusal to admit neglect. It was about smiling through discomfort, fainting through suffocation, sleeping through filth, all while presenting the image of grace. And the silence that made this possible was perhaps the dirtiest habit of all. By the final decades of the Victorian age, silence itself had hardened into a tradition as binding as lace or corsetry. It was no longer only an instinct, it was an expectation. An unspoken rule that every member of society observed without needing to be told. In parlors and theaters and bedrooms, people lived amid filth and odor, yet trained themselves not to notice, or at least not to acknowledge what they noticed. The pact reached every household. A wife might wake with a sore throat from the dust of curtains, a husband might cough from a damp, moldy bed. Children might itch from lice or rashes, but none of them named the cause. They accepted these discomforts as natural, the way one accepted rain in winter or smoke in the city. Filth was not spoken of because it was everywhere. And when something is everywhere, silence is easier than confrontation. Propriety reinforced this silence with force. To mention sweat in a parlor was to invite scandal. To speak of menstruation was to be vulgar. To suggest that gowns or sheets were unwashed was to insult one's hosts. Respectability required denial. Better to faint gracefully in a ballroom than to demand a window opened. Better to endure rashes in silence than to admit that perfume and powder were failing. Servants, though they suffered most, became part of this culture too. They gagged on dust while beating carpets, scraped gray paste of ash and sweat from shoes, boiled gowns until their arms burned. Yet they spoke nothing of it. Their work was meant to be invisible, their discomfort hidden. If they whispered at all, it was only to each other, jokes traded in kitchens or laundries about the strange contradictions of refinement. But those whispers never reached their mistress's ears. Doctors found themselves complicit as well. They treated sores caused by corsets, infections from perfume lungs scarred by powders. Yet in consultations, they couched their words carefully. Few dared to say plainly, it is the filth that sickens you. To do so would be to risk being dismissed as rude, even unprofessional. Instead, illnesses were blamed on weak constitutions, feminine delicacy, or fate. The silence thus extended into medicine itself. Even literature where satire sometimes dared to expose hypocrisy could not fully pierce the quiet. A cartoon might mock a fainting lady, a pamphlet might hint at the absurdity of powdered air, but the laughter was light, the criticism veiled. The dominant tone remained one of admiration, of respect for refinement, of praise for appearances that everyone knew were illusions. In this way, silence became more than habit. It became the very structure of Victorian society. It bound the drawing room as tightly as the corset bound the waist. It shaped conversation, behavior, even thought. To notice filth was human. To ignore it was Victorian. And so the silence endured decade after decade, sealing over coughs, disguising odors, hiding stains. It was not broken in the parlor, nor in the ballroom, nor in the bedroom. Even when illness spread, even when women fainted, even when servants collapsed from labor, silence held. The illusion of refinement demanded nothing less. When we look back now, it is not the perfumes or powders or gowns that seem most striking. It is the silence, the refusal to speak of what was obvious, the willingness to suffer rather than admit truth. It is the silence that explains how an entire society could live in filth while presenting itself as the pinnacle of elegance. And it is the silence more than the filth itself that reveals the weight Victorians carried every day. By the twilight of the Victorian age, the silence had grown so thick it seemed like part of the air itself. Parlors smelled of lavender layered over sweat bedrooms of mildew beneath perfume, yet conversation flowed as though the senses could be fooled. It was not that people lacked awareness, it was that they had trained themselves to deny awareness. Silence became both shield and prison. Everyday routines showed its reach. Women powdered their faces each morning, coughing softly as dust filled their lungs, yet no complaint passed their lips. Men fastened collars stiff with days of sweat, convincing themselves that politeness required endurance. Children wore stockings damp with filth, their feet itching with sores, but were taught not to mention it. What was hidden was ignored, and what was ignored was treated as if it did not exist. Illness spread easily under this pact. Tuberculosis crept through bedrooms heavy with dust. Rashes lingered where corsets pressed raw skin. Infections spread from shared brushes, moldy and damp, but were blamed on fate or fragile health. To admit the true cause would have been to expose not just the household, but the entire illusion of refinement. That price was too high. Silence was cheaper. Social gatherings reinforced the pact. In ballrooms, fainting became routine. A woman crumpled to the floor, revived with vinegar, returned to dance, her collapse treated as charming rather than alarming. The stifling heat, the suffocating perfumes, the sweat clinging to every body, none of it was named. Guests smiled, applauded the host, and carried the memory forward as elegance. History remembers the chandeliers and gowns, not the odors and dizziness. That is the power of silence. For servants, the silence was doubly heavy. They endured the filth, directly scrubbing sweat from corsets beating carpets, thick with dust, carrying buckets of gray bathwater. Their lungs filled with soot, their hands cracked with lye, yet they were bound by rules stricter than any corset string. To speak of the truth was to risk dismissal. Their labor was invisible by design, their discomfort erased by silence. Doctors occasionally tried to pierce the pact. They noted how powders scarred lungs, how perfumes burned skin, how moldy sheets spread illness. Yet their words rarely gained traction. Families preferred superstition. Fresh air was dangerous, frequent bathing weakened the body, changing sheets drained vitality. Science was powerless against tradition when tradition was defended by silence. The poor imitated the habits of the rich, though, with fewer means. Their gowns were cheaper, their perfumes harsh, their beds more crowded. Yet they too observed the rule. They endured the same filth, masked with the same silence, convinced that propriety demanded it. In this way, silence united the classes. A duchess in silk and a maid in cotton both shared the same air of denial. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that Victorians did not notice that they were unaware, but the record tells us otherwise. They coughed, fainted, endured rashes, and suffered infections. They noticed, but they chose silence. That choice was the essence of their refinement. To remain quiet was to prove civility. To pretend was to belong. Thus, the silence was not merely absence of words. It was a discipline, a custom, a weapon against shame. It protected appearances even as it eroded health. It allowed society to live in contradiction, draped in elegance while drowning in filth. And so the century closed with parlors, perfumed bedrooms, damp ballrooms suffocating, and voices hushed. Silence was the final veil covering sweat odors and disease, preserving the illusion until the very end. It was heavier than velvet, sharper than corset bones, more enduring than perfume. It was the defining fabric of Victorian hygiene. By the end of the 19th century, silence was not just a habit, but a form of identity. To be Victorian was to keep certain truths unspoken. Sweat odor stains and sickness, these belonged to the private world that refinement insisted did not exist. In public, every effort went toward the appearance of control, composure, and grace. What could not be polished was simply never mentioned. This silence shaped homes as much as it shaped behavior. Bedrooms with curtains closed and carpets heavy with dust became chambers of denial. Families slept in sheets stiff with sweat, inhaled the smell of mold, and awoke with throats raw. Yet each morning they rose to powder faces, lace gowns, and perfume collars. The bed's filth was left behind in silence, hidden beneath gestures of refinement. In parlors, the same rule applied. Guests sat in rooms that smelled of damp velvet and perfumed bodies, nodding politely as though the air were fresh. Conversation drifted over art, politics, or novels, never over odor. To acknowledge discomfort was to risk vulgarity. Better to smile, to sip tea, and to pretend that grace hung in the air rather than mildew. Ballrooms tested silence most cruelly. Chandeliers glittered, gowns shimmered, and the air grew suffocating. Perfume thickened, sweat dripped, alcohol reeked. Guests swayed and fainted, revived with vinegar cloths, then returned to the dance. No one dared to name what they all felt: the dizziness, the nausea, the suffocating weight of air. The silence was louder than the music, stronger than the perfume. Servants carried silence in their bodies. They coughed as they beat carpets, scraped grime from gowns, or washed moldy sheets. They knew the truth most clearly, handling the filth their employers denied. Yet they obeyed the rule. To speak would be to break propriety, to risk dismissal. Their silence was survival. Doctors too bowed to it. They treated rashes from corsets, infections from perfumes, lungs weakened by powders. But in polite company, they rarely named the cause. Illness was attributed to delicate constitutions, bad air, or fate. Medicine bent beneath the weight of custom. Science could not compete with the silence. The poor, though burdened with harsher conditions, mirrored the silence of the wealthy. Their dresses were patched, their perfumes cheap, their rooms smaller. Yet they followed the same rules. They endured lice rashes and odor without complaint. Respectability demanded denial, and even those with little clung fiercely to the illusion of refinement. What united rich and poor alike was not cleanliness, but silence. A duchess powdered her face while coughing from the dust. A servant powdered hers with cheaper chalk in a room no cleaner. Both smiled. Both endured. Both kept quiet. Silence was the thread that stitched the classes together, binding them in the same illusion. Looking back, this silence reveals more than neglect. It reveals a society that chose illusion over truth, appearances over health. It reveals how far people will go to protect dignity, even at the cost of comfort. And it reminds us that the strongest chains are often invisible, not corset laces or carpet dust, but the silence that prevents anyone from admitting what is plain to see. The longer the silence endured, the heavier it became. It was woven into every moment of life, so complete that breaking it seemed unthinkable. To mention the odor of sweat in a ballroom was as shocking as shouting during a prayer. To admit that one's sheets had not been washed in months was to risk disgrace. And so the silence grew not only as a denial of filth, but as proof of refinement itself. In this world, smells became secrets. The scent of unwashed hair of mildew and curtains of mold in mattresses, all were noticed but never named. Families sat together at supper, their clothing steeped in sweat and perfume, eating quietly while odors lingered around them. Guests visiting for the night lay in beds heavy with dust, but rose in the morning to thank their hosts politely for their comfort. Even in intimacy, silence held. Husbands and wives sharing beds that reeked of filth did not speak of it to one another. To do so would have been vulgar, a violation of the unspoken pact. Superstition gave silence further strength. Fresh air was feared as dangerous, frequent bathing was believed to weaken the body, and washing linens too often was said to drain vitality. These beliefs were easier to accept than the truth that disease spread in dust and mold, that infection thrived in unwashed sheets. Silence allowed superstition to survive, defending tradition against the intrusion of reason. The consequences were everywhere. Rashes festered beneath corsets, infections spread through shared brushes, lungs scarred from powders inhaled daily. Servants labored in clouds of dust, carrying away filth their mistresses refused to acknowledge. Yet illness was explained away as weakness or fate. Silence transformed preventable harm into destiny, and families endured it quietly. Ballrooms offered the clearest theater of this pact. Dozens fainted from suffocating air revived with vinegar, then returned to the dance. To speak of the stench was unthinkable. To endure it was refinement. Guests congratulated hosts for elegance, never admitting that the evening left them coughing and dizzy. History remembered the chandeliers, the music, the gowns, never the heaviness of the air. Silence preserved the illusion even as bodies collapsed beneath it. Literature and satire occasionally tried to pierce the quiet. A cartoon might mock the reliance on perfume, a pamphlet might hint at the absurdity of powdered faces, but these were faint voices, laughed at and quickly forgotten. The silence of daily life was stronger than any printed word. This silence united all classes. The wealthy endured it beneath lace and velvet. The poor bore it in patched cotton and crowded rooms. But both played the same game. Both pretended not to notice what surrounded them. Both believed that silence was safer than truth. Looking back, this pact is perhaps more unsettling than the filth itself. It shows how deeply appearances can rule a society, how strongly denial can shape daily life. It was not only sweat and mildew that filled Victorian homes, it was silence, thick and unbroken, heavier than dust, darker than mold. In the end, it is this silence that tells us the most. It reveals a culture that chose illusion over health propriety, over honesty, endurance, over comfort. It shows us not only what Victorians lived with, but what they refused to see. And it reminds us that sometimes the most revealing detail of all is not what people said, but what they never dared to say. As the century wore on, the silence did not weaken, it deepened. It became so ingrained that even laughter, conversation, and intimacy were shaped by it. In drawing rooms, women sat together in rustling gowns, their cheeks powdered white, their hands clasping perfumed handkerchiefs. They spoke of novels, politics, and family news, but never of the sour air trapped in curtains or the mildew creeping in corners. The odors were present, undeniable, yet they floated unmentioned, as though society had agreed to breathe them in without acknowledgement. In ballrooms, the spectacle was grander, but no less suffocating. Couples danced shoulder to shoulder beneath glittering chandeliers, their bodies slick with sweat, their lungs burning from the haze of perfume. Women fainted again and again, collapsing into the arms of attendants. Vinegar cloths revived them, and the music played on. It was almost ritualistic, the fall, the revival, the return to the dance. And still not a word was spoken about the true cause. The silence carried the evening more reliably than the orchestra. Servants who witnessed everything most clearly became keepers of this silence. They laundered stained rags used for menstruation, scraped ash and sweat from shoes-beat mattresses until dust filled their lungs. They saw the sores under corsets, the lice crawling in sheets the perfumes poured into places that burned. Yet their voices were bound by necessity. To speak would have been to insult their employers to risk their place in the household, and so they laughed only among themselves, whispers in kitchens or laundries, knowing truths they could never name aloud. Doctors, too, tiptoed around the silence. They treated women coughing blood, their lungs scarred from powders. They tended to rashes from corsets and infections from perfume. Yet in consultations they used careful words, delicate health frailty, a weak constitution. The true causes were known but rarely said. To speak plainly was to risk impropriety. Even medicine bowed before the weight of silence. Superstition filled the gaps where honesty might have lived. Fresh air was said to cause illness, frequent bathing, to weaken the body, changing sheets too often to drain vitality. These beliefs justified the filth and made silence easier. Why speak of mold if opening a window was thought to bring death? Why mention lice if changing linen too often was considered dangerous? Silence and superstition walked hand in hand, protecting tradition from truth. The poor imitated the habits of the rich, though their gowns were patched and their perfumes cheap. Their homes were smaller, their air heavier with smoke, their beds more crowded. Yet they too obeyed the rule of silence. To complain was vulgar. To endure was respectable. Thus, rich and poor alike were bound together by the same denial, united by the same invisible thread. It is almost absurd that an entire society chose to live this way, but the evidence is plain. Diaries hint at fainting spells never explained. Servants' records describe endless labor without complaint. Satirical prints poke gently at the absurdities, but never loudly enough to break the spell. The silence held fast, stronger than walls, heavier than curtains, more enduring than lace. And perhaps that is the greatest contradiction of all. Victorians were a people obsessed with refinement, propriety, and morality. Yet behind the pale faces and polished manners lay bodies, unwashed beds uncleaned, and lungs filled with dust. They endured it not because they were unaware, but because they refused to admit what they knew. Silence was not weakness, it was discipline. A performance as rehearsed as a dance, as strict as any etiquette book. Looking back, it is this silence that chills us more than the filth itself. It shows us how far people will go to protect appearances, how much suffering they will accept rather than admit truth. It was the silence heavier than perfume, thicker than dust, that defined Victorian hygiene. The silence that smothered Victorian homes was not merely social courtesy. It became a kind of invisible architecture. It filled drawing rooms more surely than gaslight, clung to ballrooms more stubbornly than perfume, and wrapped around beds more tightly than curtains. It was the one element present in every household, unspoken yet universal. In parlors, families entertained guests amid furniture upholstered with years of dust and fabric steeped in sweat. The air was heavy, scented with lavender sachets and stale coal smoke. Everyone smelled it. Everyone ignored it. Politeness demanded the pretense of freshness. Tea was poured. Conversation drifted across novels and politics, and the silence held. The true atmosphere, mildew, sweat, perfume, remained nameless, though every breath carried it in. At social gatherings, silence reached its most dramatic form. Fainting became as common as dancing. Women collapsed in overheated halls, revived discreetly, and returned to the floor as though nothing had happened. Guests smiled, complimented their hosts, and preserved the illusion of elegance. To admit the truth that the air was suffocating with sweat, alcohol, and perfume would have been to strip away the entire performance. Better to faint with grace than to name the cause. Servants became silent archivists of filth. They shook curtains that released clouds of dust, carried mattresses that reeked of mold, laundered gowns, heavy with sweat. Their lungs bore the weight of every chore, yet they knew better than to speak. To complain was to risk dismissal. To stay silent was to survive. Their bodies became repositories of what society refused to acknowledge. Even medicine bowed to silence. Doctors saw the sores beneath corsets, the lungs damaged by powders, the infections spreading through unwashed beds. Yet they rarely spoke plainly. Illness was blamed on weak constitutions or bad air, never on the customs of hygiene themselves. Science, like servants, learned to stay quiet. Tradition was too strong propriety, too delicate to endure truth. Superstition cloaked silence in justification. Fresh air was feared as dangerous, so windows remained shut. Frequent bathing was thought to weaken the body, so perfumes took the place of soap. Changing linens too often was believed to drain vitality, so beds reeked for months. These beliefs offered a ready excuse for inaction, a way to treat denial as wisdom. Silence and superstition worked together, making neglect respectable. The poor imitated the wealthy, though with fewer resources. Their homes were smaller, their gowns patched, their perfumes harsh. Yet they too obeyed the rule. To complain of odor or filth was vulgar. To endure it was refinement. Silence thus became the great equalizer. Whether in satin or cotton, in marble halls or crowded rooms, Victorians carried the same burden of denial. And so the silence grew until it was more than habit, it was identity. To be Victorian was to endure odor without comment, filth without acknowledgement, illness without admission. It was to smile through coughs, to bow through faintness, to dance through suffocation. Silence itself became a performance as essential to refinement as lace jewels or powdered skin. Looking back, it is not the perfumes or powders that most reveal this world, nor the gowns or the ballrooms. It is the silence, the deliberate, disciplined refusal to speak. That silence is what allowed filth to masquerade as elegance, what bound rich and poor in the same illusion, what kept an entire society breathing dust and perfume, while insisting it was breathing grace. The silence was heavier than velvet, sharper than corset bones, more enduring than perfume. It was the true mark of Victorian refinement, and perhaps its greatest hypocrisy. By the last years of the century, silence had become so woven into daily life that it seemed natural, almost invisible. It was no longer a choice but a reflex. To cough in a powdered parlor and say nothing. To faint in a stifling ballroom and rise with a smile. To lie in a bed that smelled of mildew and speak only of sweet dreams. This was refinement. This was Victorian life. Every class participated in this quiet. The wealthy masked filth with lace and perfume, presenting their homes as models of elegance. The poor endured the same conditions in humbler rooms, their clothes patched and their perfumes diluted. Yet both groups observed the same rule: silence. A duchess might powder her face with costly French chalk, a seamstress with rough market plaster, but both coughed quietly and smiled through it. The illusion mattered more than the truth. The contradictions piled upon one another. Women endured rashes from corsets and infections from perfume, yet said nothing. Families slept in beds alive with fleas and lice, yet treated illness as fate. Servants hauled heavy gowns, scrubbed ash from shoes, and shook curtains thick with dust, yet swallowed their complaints. Silence bound them all together, each complicit in maintaining appearances. Doctors tried to name the causes, but their voices were muted by propriety. They spoke of frailty, of delicate constitutions, of mysterious airs. Rarely did they confront the truth that gowns rotted with sweat, that sheets spread disease, that powders poisoned lungs. To do so would have been to insult their patients, to trespass upon the sacred territory of silence. And so even science bent beneath it. Superstition lent the silent strength. Fresh air was feared as dangerous, so windows stayed sealed. Frequent bathing was said to weaken the body, so perfume took the place of soap. Changing linens too often was believed to drain vitality, so beds remained foul for months. These beliefs cloaked neglect with authority, turning silence into wisdom. Satirists hinted at the truth in cartoons and pamphlets. Servants whispered in kitchens. Guests endured in silence, thanking their hosts politely after nights spent in beds that reeked of mold. But these voices were faint, never strong enough to pierce the illusion. Refinement demanded denial, and denial demanded quiet. What is most remarkable is how willingly people endured it. They did not simply accept filth, they defended it by refusing to speak. They chose to protect appearances even when health suffered. A society that lectured endlessly on morality and purity allowed its homes to become breeding grounds for disease so long as no one named it aloud. Silence was the final ornament of refinement, as essential as lace or jewels. Looking back, it is this silence that reveals the deepest truth of Victorian hygiene. It was not ignorance, for they noticed. It was not lack of means, for even the wealthy endured it. It was the choice to value appearance over reality, to let silence smooth over contradictions too painful to confront. And so the century closed with women powdered and perfumed, men polished and composed, children dressed neatly in stiff collars, all of them breathing air heavy with mildew, lying in bed steeped in sweat and moving through rooms filled with dust. They did not speak of it. They smiled instead. The silence held heavier than the gowns, thicker than the perfumes, more enduring than the superstition. It was the final word of Victorian refinement, unspoken but everywhere. The silence that defined Victorian life was not a thin veil. It was a weight. It pressed down upon every household, every parlor, every ballroom, until it became the very language of refinement. To speak of odor, of filth, of sweat was to risk vulgarity. To remain silent was to prove one's place in polite society. And so the silence grew thicker than dust, more suffocating than perfume, binding people together in a pact of denial. In homes, this silence meant that servants beat carpets and shook curtains without acknowledgement of the clouds they released. Families breathed in the particles, coughing discreetly into handkerchiefs, never naming the cause. Beds were slept in for weeks without washing their linen stiff with sweat, their mattresses alive with insects. Yet each morning women powdered their faces and spoke of novels or church sermons, not of the mold that had grown in their rooms overnight. At gatherings, the silence became theater. Ballrooms shimmered with chandeliers, dresses swirled, music filled the air, but so too did sweat, alcohol, and perfume. Women fainted, men gasped quietly for breath, yet the evening was remembered as graceful. Guests smiled, congratulated their hosts, and never mentioned the suffocating truth. To do so would have been to tear away the illusion, and illusions were sacred. Servants more than anyone bore the weight of this pact. They scraped filth from shoes, laundered gowns reeking of sweat and perfume, carried buckets of gray bathwater. Their bodies suffered most, their lungs filled with dust, their skin cracked by lie. Yet they held their tongues. Survival depended on silence as much as labor did. They knew the truth their mistresses denied, but they spoke them only in whispers to one another, never beyond the kitchen door. Doctors, too, were trapped by the custom. They treated rashes from corsets, infections from perfume lungs scarred by powders. They saw the connection but softened their words. Frail health, weak constitution, delicate nerves. To say plainly that filth caused illness was to insult patients who prided themselves on refinement. Medicine itself bent to silence its truths, disguised in polite phrases. The poor copied the wealthy, though their gowns were patched and their rooms smaller. They endured lice, mildew, and suffocating air, but followed the same rules. They masked odor with cheap perfume, scrubbed stains only when forced, and kept their complaints unspoken. Silence was as much a mark of respectability in a crowded tenement as it was in a marble hall. It is almost absurd to think of it now, an entire society that chose not to see what was plainly visible, not to smell what filled every breath. But this was their discipline. Silence became the highest form of propriety, stronger than any etiquette of the dinner table or the dance floor. It was the thread that bound the illusion together, preventing it from unraveling. Looking back, it is the silence itself that unsettles us most, more than the powders or perfumes, more than the unwashed beds or shared brushes. It is the refusal to speak that reveals the truth of Victorian hygiene. They knew, they endured, and they chose denial. In the end, silence was not the absence of words, it was the presence of control. It protected appearances, sustained illusions, and smothered truth. Heavier than velvet curtains, sharper than corset bones, more enduring than perfume. It was the essence of refinement itself. By the closing years of the Victorian era, silence had hardened into law. It was not written in books or spoken in rules, but it governed more strictly than any statute. To be respectable was to ignore. To be refined was to endure. The pact was universal, whether in a grand house on a London square or a cramped room in an industrial town, the same silence ruled. Everyday life was soaked in it. A wife smelled mildew rising from the curtains as she sewed near the window, but she never remarked upon it. A husband coughed from the dust of carpets as he read his paper, but he blamed the weather instead. Children scratched at lice or rashes, but were scolded into quiet if they complained. Illness, discomfort, filth, all were lived with, never named. In parlors, guests smiled through the sour heaviness of perfume and sweat. They spoke of politics, of novels, of travel, but not of the stench that clung to their clothes. To acknowledge odor was to expose hosts to break propriety. Better to endure in silence than to risk shame. In ballrooms, the spectacle was the same. Women fainted, men gasped for air chandeliers glittered above clouds of suffocating perfume. Yet when the music ended, the evening was praised as a triumph of elegance. No mention was made of dizziness or nausea. The silence smoothed every memory into something refined. Servants bore the worst of it. They shook curtains that released clouds of dust, beat mattresses alive with insects, laundered gowns, stiff with sweat. Their lungs ached, their backs bent, but their voices stayed quiet. To complain was to risk dismissal. Their silence was not only custom, but survival. Doctors bound by the same propriety spoke in guarded phrases. They treated infections from perfume and coughs from powders, but blamed delicate health or frailty. Few dared to say plainly, "Filth sickens you." Medicine-like conversation bent beneath the weight of denial. Superstition reinforced it all. Fresh air was thought dangerous, so windows remained shut. Frequent bathing was feared, so perfumes took its place. Changing linens too often was believed to sap vitality, so beds rotted under their sleepers. These beliefs justified silence, making neglect sound like wisdom. Rich and poor alike obeyed the pact. A duchess powdered her face with Paris chalk. A seamstress used rough plaster. Both coughed quietly, both smiled politely, both endured. Silence was the thread that bound them together, stitching the illusion of refinement across every class. Looking back, it is tempting to see Victorians as ignorant. But they were not. They noticed, they suffered, and still they chose silence. That choice was the essence of their refinement. Not beauty, not cleanliness, but denial. And so the century closed in quiet rooms filled with odor, ballrooms clouded with perfume beds, heavy with mildew. The silence was heavier, still smothering truth more thoroughly than dust, concealing filth more stubbornly than lace. It was the final ornament of Victorian life, the unspoken law that bound a society together in shared endurance and shared illusion. The silence of Victorian hygiene did not simply hover in the background, it shaped the rhythm of daily life. It was there each morning when women rose from damp, unwashed sheets, dressed in gowns, stiff with yesterday's sweat, and dusted powder over their faces. It was there in the afternoons as families gathered in parlors, breathing the heavy air thick with coal smoke, perfume, and mildew. It was there each evening in ballrooms where chandeliers sparkled while lungs burned. Silence was the invisible partner to every gesture, every smile, every polite nod. The culture of denial was so deeply ingrained that to break it was unthinkable. A guest who remarked on the odor of a drawing room would be seen as vulgar. A servant who mentioned the filth of a mattress risked dismissal. Even within families, silence reigned. Husbands and wives shared beds alive with lice, yet spoke only of dreams. Mothers taught daughters to endure corset sores and menstrual odor without complaint. Children learned early that to notice filth was rude, but to ignore it was refined. This discipline turned suffering into habit. Women fainted in ballrooms, revived, and returned to dance as though nothing had happened. Men coughed from lungs scarred by powders, yet continued to praise the grace of their wives and daughters. Servants collapsed from labor, their bodies weakened by dust and steam, but rose again to preserve appearances. No one spoke. Silence absorbed their discomfort, transforming pain into propriety. Doctors moved carefully within this web. They knew powder scarred lungs, perfumes burned skin, unwashed linens spread disease. But they softened their words, delicate health, frail constitutions, phrases that preserved propriety. To tell the truth outright was to risk offense. Medicine itself bowed before silence, its cures muted by custom. Superstition lent silence its armor. Fresh air was thought to bring sickness, so windows stayed closed. Baths were believed to weaken the body, so perfumes took their place. Washing sheets too often was feared to drain vitality, so beds remained foul. These beliefs made denial respectable, turning silence into wisdom. Even satire struggled against it. A cartoon might mock the reliance on perfume, a pamphlet might jest about fainting in ballrooms. But laughter was muted, quickly folded back into propriety. The silence remained stronger than any criticism. What is most remarkable is how silence united rich and poor alike. The wealthy powdered their faces with costly chalk. The poor used rough plaster. The wealthy perfumed their gowns with roses, the poor with diluted cologne. Yet both endured the same filth, and both kept the same silence. It was the one true equalizer in a society divided by class. Looking back, it is clear that the silence was not ignorance. It was choice. Victorians saw, smelled, and suffered, but they preferred illusion. They chose to smile through discomfort, to bow through nausea, to sleep through filth. Silence allowed them to protect appearances even when health was sacrificed. And so, the 19th century closed not with voices raised in complaint, but with silence heavier than dust, thicker than perfume, more enduring than superstition. It was the last word of Victorian refinement, unspoken yet everywhere, the fabric that bound a society together in denial. By the waning years of Queen Victoria's reign, silence had become so habitual that it felt like virtue itself. To ignore discomfort was praised as strength. To endure filth without complaint was seen as refinement. The absence of words was mistaken for dignity, and so the silence deepened until it seemed part of the very fabric of society. Everywhere it lingered. In parlors where heavy curtains trapped mildew and coal smoke, guests sipped tea and chatted of literature while breathing air thick enough to sting their throats. In ballrooms where chandeliers glimmered above perfume, sweat, and alcohol pressed down like a second atmosphere. In bedrooms where sheets stiff with sweat clung to bodies and mattresses sagged with years of filth. Families slept as if nothing were amiss. All of it endured, all of it unnamed. Children were taught early to embrace this quiet discipline. A daughter who wrinkled her nose at odor was scolded. A son who complained of lice was hushed. They learned that refinement meant not noticing that propriety was measured not by comfort, but by composure. By the time they reached adulthood, silence was second nature, as automatic as lacing a corset or buttoning a collar. Servants carried the silence more heavily than anyone. They saw the filth directly scraping perfume-soaked corsets, washing stained rags, beating dust out of mattresses. Their hands bore burns from lye, their lungs filled with soot and powder, their backs bent under endless loads. Yet they spoke none of it. Their livelihoods depended on silence, and so their suffering remained unseen, even as it preserved the illusion their mistresses prized. Doctors, too, were trapped. They treated coughs from powdered lungs, infections from perfumes, rashes from unwashed linens. They knew the causes, but their diagnoses were couched in soft phrases, frail nerves, sensitive systems, delicate health. To tell the truth outright was to risk impropriety. Medicine itself bent before the law of silence, its science muted by custom. The poor mirrored the wealthy. Their gowns were patched, their perfumes cheaper, their rooms smaller. But they followed the same rules. They endured filth in silence, convinced that to complain was vulgar. In this way, silence erased distinctions of class. A duchess in satin and a seamstress in cotton shared the same pact, to see, to smell, to suffer, but never to say. Satirists tried to expose the contradiction, but their voices were faint. A cartoon might mock fainting ladies, a pamphlet might jest about perfume masking filth. But the laughter was light, the criticism veiled. The silence remained stronger than satire, heavier than truth. Looking back, this is the most unsettling detail of all. Not the powders that scarred lungs, nor the perfumes that burned skin, nor the beds alive with insects, but the silence that kept it all intact. Victorians were not blind. They noticed, they endured. But they chose denial, they chose appearances over comfort, propriety, over honesty, illusion over truth. And so the age closed with smiles, painted on powdered faces, with gowns perfumed to hide sweat, with beds left foul beneath lace canopies. Silence was the final ornament of refinement, unseen, unspoken, yet heavier than velvet, sharper than corset bones, more enduring than perfume. It was the true legacy of Victorian hygiene and its greatest hypocrisy. The story of Victorian hygiene does not end with soap, perfumes, or powders, it ends with silence. A silence so thick it became the final curtain draped across society, hiding what everyone already knew. To live in the 19th century was to breathe it in, to speak around it, and to let it shape every gesture of refinement. It was there in every household. Women powdered their faces until their lungs burned. Men wore collars stiff with sweat. Children scratched quietly at lice. Servants laundered gowns that reeked of mildew, beat carpets alive with dust, and carried buckets of gray bathwater until their arms ached. All of them knew the truth: filth was everywhere, but none of them said it. Silence bound them together stronger than duty, stronger than shame. It was there in ballrooms where chandeliers glittered over air, heavy with perfume, alcohol, and sweat. Guests fainted, revived, and returned to the dance. The spectacle was called elegance, though every breath carried suffocation. Silence turned collapse into charm, discomfort into refinement. The illusion survived because no one dared to pierce it with words. It was there in bedrooms where sheets stiffened with months of sweat, where mattresses sagged with years of filth, where pets shed fur into the very beds their mistresses slept in. Families endured the smells, the rashes, the insects, but spoke only of rest. Silence transformed misery into routine filth, into propriety. Doctors worked within its grip, softening diagnoses into phrases like frail health and delicate constitution. Servants bore its weight most cruelly, their bodies breaking under the labor of disguising filth. The wealthy hid behind velvet curtains, the poor endured in crowded rooms, but all obeyed the same law. To notice was human, to ignore was Victorian. This silence, more than perfumes or powders, defined the age. It was heavier than velvet, thicker than coal dust, sharper than corset bones. It turned suffering into etiquette, denial into refinement. It made filth bearable by refusing to name it. It was the invisible stage upon which the entire society performed. And perhaps, looking back, it is the silence itself that shocks us most. Not the perfumes poured on raw skin, not the gowns worn for weeks unwashed, not the beds crawling with lice, but the collective agreement never to say so. An entire society lived in denial, sustained by a silence deeper than dust, more suffocating than the air of their ballrooms. Victorian hygiene was disgusting, but even more astonishing was the agreement never to speak of it. That silence is what truly reveals the Victorian world, a culture that chose appearance over health illusion, over truth, denial, over honesty. It was their most enduring invention and their greatest hypocrisy.